Okay, a couple days ago I did a video on center fifth coil hydraulic shock that everybody's kind of experimenting with now, and my take on how all that works. Well, I left out a very crucial part of that, and it's the left rear shock, left rear front, I should say, and what Longhorn's doing as opposed to what Rocket's doing. So let's dig into that left rear front shock a little bit and talk about that. Let's roll the intro and let's get into it. I've spent the last 30 plus years working on race cars, building race cars, and racing cars. And I'm here to help you better understand racing technology. Okay, left rear front shock. For years and years, we used to run it on the bird cage in the front. And you had the spring in the back, and you had this left rear front shock. And it was mainly built and used to keep the car kind of controllable. You could just run that left rear behind, but you had to really beef up the compression in that thing, and it just got crazy. The best thing you could do then for the front is to run a front shock on there, and it just made the car more stable and drivable. The trick with the front shock is the rebound. You had to take all the rebound out of the shock to maintain as much traction as you could, because in the slick, rebound takes out traction. It doesn't allow that when you get compression, any rebound in there wouldn't let the tire fall onto the track and maintain that stretch for traction. So we've been all through that. We've been playing with that for years on everything from big bleed to like a little coil spring in there that would open and close, and I've been through it all and a ton of experimenting with that to try to get all the rebound out I could. I even used to custom build the front shock mounts to kind of speed up that thing there so you could take as much rotation out of it, out of the front shock, while still maintaining the compression. The length of the shock mount up there I shortened up so it didn't feel the rebound as much. We've been all through that. And then there were different chassis manufacturers. Like I know Pierce with his own cars used to run the shock on top of the rear end to take the indexing out of it and to make it more true to the chassis. We've been through a lot of that stuff. And that's where Longhorn steps in. Longhorn started, and I think it was their advantage for a long time, is they started to clamp the left rear shock to the rear end tube, almost to act like a kicker, and it works with the fifth coil shock, kind of. Let me explain a little more of that. Years and years ago, I got into it in the mid-90s. I was a sprint car guy, open wheel guy before that. I got like really into late model racing in the mid-90s. And when I was in it and getting into it, we ran what we called a clamp spring on the front. Nobody ran spring behind. That wasn't really even thought about until Skip Arp did it, and I think it was 98, 99, somewhere through there. But we always used to run a 4-bar setup with the shock on the front and nothing behind, and it was as the birdcage index there, it would actually unload the wedge out of the car. Well, Skip figured out if you take that shock and spring, put it behind the rear end, as the rear end drops, it actually started to keep the wedge in there. And that's where we are now. We're much advanced, but that's basically, I even think they wrote rules saying you can't run anything else. I'm not sure. It's crazy now with these suspension rules. Anyways, when we first started putting that spring behind the rear end, we were running also, instead of the spring in the front, guys started what we called clamp. And it was a bracket that actually clamped and pinned to the tube of the rear end. So when you got on the gas, it would actually take that shock and spring and actually load that left rear, and it gave you a ton of traction. You know, the car's three-wheeled almost all the way around the track. It was a crazy time, but that thing, man, that made some traction. But then we got away from that, and I mean, at that time, there were guys like Steve Francis, for instance, with his rocket stuff, used to double clamp. Put the clamp in the front on the left rear and the clamp on the right rear, and man, he just went to town with that old rocket black front end stuff. But fast forward to today, and our standard setup now is that left rear spring behind and a left rear shock in front to kind of tame everything down and make it drivable. But now what Longhorn started to do is they started to clamp that left rear shock in the front like we used to do back in the mid 90s with a shock and spring. They run the shock and spring in the back yet, but they clamp the shock in the front. And when you get on the gas with that big compression, that not only held the wedge in with the left rear behind, it also added traction by forcing that left rear front up into the chassis and loaded that left rear even more. I think that's why Longhorn's philosophy has never been really worrying about coming off the corner and traction. It's getting the right balance and getting the right entry. I heard someplace that Longhorn's theory to this is it's all about entry into the center. If you can get entry and you can get across the center good, more than likely if you park the car in the right spot, you're coming off the corner. And I think a lot of it has to do with that left rear front shock being clamped. Now let's get back to the fifth coil and that hydraulic fifth coil shock. See, the fifth coil is clamped to the rear end too, it's just much farther forward. It's doing the same job as that clamped left rear front. They're both torquing as that car goes to leave the corner and you get on the gas, that rear end wraps up and torques. So they're both working together. But now it's a little bit different because that left rear shock and spring combo and a left rear suspension, you still want to maintain zero rebound or as little as possible to keep that tire stretched, but yet you want the clamping forces of that thing to help plant the tires to come off the corner. That's why I think I mentioned in that other video that there's probably a relationship in rebound between that right front and the rebound of that fifth coil hydraulic shock, or even regular fifth coil. There's a relationship there somewhere. I'm not sure. I can't give you numbers, but there's something going on there. Well, now that I think about it more, there has to be a relationship between the three. The right front rebound, the rebound of the fifth coil, and the rebound of that left rear front on like a Longhorn. I know Bloomquist cars run this also, where it's a clamp deal. And it's weird with that left rear front though, is you still want to maintain the drop. So I don't know if you're gonna want to put, is you want to keep the car loaded, I think, with that fifth coil, but that left rear front, I think, would go in the opposite thinking. So you'd still have a stiff compression, but you'd still want to maintain that zero rebound to it so that left rear can move around some and drop and keep the tire loaded, but yet you want to keep the car and keep the rear end wrapped up against that bump stop in the middle of the car or loaded against a spring if you're running a standard fifth coil. So when you take that left rear front shock and you were to clamp it to the tube, and I think you could take the same shock and put it in there and just make sure you're not getting the rebound in there, or if you do, just a little bit of rebound just to make the car drivable. Making the car drivable is what we put that shock in there to begin with for. So you want to make sure that the car is nice and smooth and drivable, but yet make sure that you're getting the traction you can, all the traction you can get off the corner from that clamp and that left rear tire floating around. I mentioned in another video about making some slop and putting some nice float to that left rear. But the rebound on that front shock then is something that you could play with, or there's a relationship to the center and that left rear front. Like, you may have to tie that center up, but yet take it all out for the exit on a slick track. Or if you want to make the car more drivable, you know, you might want to relax that center a little bit, but then increase the rebound in that left rear front. The idea is keeping the car loaded. That's why we make the cars run at that attitude. Some guys are putting a lot of compression into it so the car don't sit down. Some guys are adding a lot of rebound to the right front so the car don't pop up. There's a marriage now between your right front compression and rebound, your center shock compression and rebound, and that left rear front shock compression and rebound. I think you got to work in conjunction kind of with all these to find a sweet spot on your car with your driver. There's also some work you could do with the left rear behind on the spring deal, but it seems like more and more we're not getting into the big hooks that we used to see. It's more kind of a zero index thing, maintaining consistency. Some people might be going for the big hooks. What I mean by the big hooks is when your left rear starts to drop, if you chart the left rear spring and shock movement, when that happens, it'll get to the point where it's it's dropping a little bit. As the bird cage drops an inch, maybe your left rear spring and shock drop's only a 1/4 inch, and that's maintaining a wedge in there. On a big hook car, it'll, if you chart that, it'll kind of come down, it'll lose, and then it'll do a rock in the cradle thing like I talk. And it'll rock in the cradle, and then at some point it'll start to hook back in. Well, I think what a lot of guys are doing now is it's almost kind of linear, and I call it zero index or close to zero, where the left rear shock maintains a certain preload all through the travel, and it's just dropping maybe a 1/4 inch without that big hook back in. Yeah, I don't have any drawing board stuff today, but I think the biggest takeaways on this video is kind of keep in the back of your mind now as you're adjusting to think about what's going on with the compression and rebound on the right front, the compression and rebound in that center fifth coil, and the compression and rebound on that left rear front. Especially if you're like a Longhorn guy or you got that left rear front clamped up. And by the way, if you have any other chassis brand, even Rocket, I would suggest now that you clamp that left rear front shock. I don't know what the Rocket 2.0 stuff has, but I know their 1.0 stuff was still the old-fashioned on the birdcage deal, and I really believe in that left rear clamped front shock ahead. There's something there. You just got to play with all those three, compression and rebound, to find a sweet spot for you. So if you like this video and you want to see more, I have a full archive of them over at Hogan Technologies. If you don't have my first book, you can get it on Amazon. There's links down below for that. I am working on another book. It's just taken me time, and I got other projects, and I want to do this next book and offer better stuff and more updated stuff than just rehashing the old one. So it's coming, it's taking time, but I'm still working on it. Hit the subscribe button, hit the like button, and be safe, and we'll see you in the next video.